The historical As, or Alans, may be the mythological Æsir, and Snorri knew it. Welcome to the Woden Files.
Yeah, that is quite the statement to open with.
It really is. But before we get into the heavy lifting of the sources for this deep dive, I want you to picture something. Just, imagine you are a Roman historian in the 1st century.
Okay, setting the scene.
Right. You are standing on the edge of the known civilized world. You're looking out across the vast, endless Eurasian steppe. And what you see isn't just empty grassland.
Far from it.
Yeah, you're looking at a terrifying, highly disciplined wall of heavily armored professional cavalry. I mean, these aren't just casual raiders. They are a complex, terrifyingly effective military society.
And they commanded absolute fear and respect.
Exactly. Now, imagine someone telling you that in about 1,000 years, the descendants of these very real flesh-and-blood horsemen would be worshipped as the supreme gods of the Viking Age.
It sounds completely absurd on its face. I mean, it sounds like a bad fantasy novel pitch, honestly.
It really does. But today, we are going to look at a truly massive stack of historical dossiers, geographic records, linguistic studies, all of it.
There is a lot of material to get through.
There is. And the mission for this deep dive is to lay out a strong, undeniable case that the Norse gods, the famous Æsir, are actually a mythological echo of that real historical people you just described.
The Halens.
Right, the Ellens, who were crucially also known as the A's.
And I think we should set some immediate guardrails for you listening right now, just so you know exactly what we are and, what we are not claiming here.
Yeah, that's important. We have to clarify that.
Because the premise here is absolutely not that a single pure nation state packed their bags, followed a literal guy named Odin out of the Caucasus, and just marched in a straight line to Sweden over a long weekend.
Right. History does not work like that at all.
No, it doesn't. What we are really examining in these sources is human memory. We are looking at how centuries of grinding historical migrations, complex military coalitions, and just absolute devastating frontier chaos were processed.
And eventually compressed by medieval writers into what I like to call a mythological ZIP file.
I love that concept, the mythological ZIP file.
Because when you think about it, that is exactly what human memory does to massive trauma over centuries. It's like the ultimate game of historical telephone.
Right. The names of the generals and the specific valleys they fought in, they start out completely real.
But then, after 800 years of retelling around campfires, passing through different languages, enduring the collapse of actual empires, the data gets corrupted.
But in the most beautiful way possible.
Exactly. The warlords turn into gods. The enemy tribes turn into frost giants. And you might be asking yourself right now, why does this matter to me?
Why should you care about some medieval Norse texts and a bunch of ancient steppe nomads, right?
Right. And you should care, because this entirely changes how we view our own storytelling. It proves that ancient people didn't just sit in a dark room and invent fantasy worlds out of thin air.
They mythologized their own traumatic history.
Yes. They took the absolute terrifying collapse of their world and engineered it into an epic.
So to really understand how a breathing, bleeding people became a pantheon of gods, we have to start by grounding them in reality, don't we?
We do. We need to understand who these people actually were in the flesh.
Well, the Alans were not a myth. I mean, they are a heavily documented historical reality. They burst into the historical records around the 1st century AD.
Okay, so who were they ethnically?
Ethnically, they were an Indo-Iranian nomadic people, and they were famous, or honestly, perhaps infamous, across the ancient world as formidable professional warriors.
Right. They were the undisputed expert cavalrymen of the Eurasian steppes.
Yes. And if you read the primary sources, the Romans and the Greeks were absolutely terrified of them.
But there is also this deep, begrudging respect to the texts. I mean, the Romans hired them as mercenaries whenever they could afford to.
Because if you had Alan cavalry on your flank, you were probably going to win the battle. It was that simple.
But reading through the stack of research we have today, it becomes pretty clear they weren't just one static, monolithic group of people.
Not at all. And that is a foundational point for everything that follows in this deep dive. The Alans were part of a much larger, rolling historical succession out on the steppes.
Like, they're linked to earlier groups, right?
Exactly. They are inextricably linked to incredibly powerful earlier nomadic groups that you might have come across in ancient history.
Like the Sarmatians.
The Sarmatians, the Massagetae, the Eorsi. The way to think of the Alans is as a massive, highly successful confederation.
So as they moved and conquered, They were actively absorbing other tribes.
Yes, they assimilated other tribes into their ranks constantly. They were a dynamic, deeply mixed political and military entity.
So it wasn't about pure genetics. If you fought well and swore allegiance to the Allan leadership, you became part of the Confederation.
Precisely. It was a fluid military machine, not a closed-off genetic club.
Okay, so they are this absolute powerhouse operating on the steppes, absorbing cultures, building this massive military reputation.
Right.
But if we are trying to connect them to the Norse gods, the Æsir, we have to talk about the name. We need to open the ethnonym dossier.
We do. Because if they were only ever called Ellens, we wouldn't be having this conversation today.
But they went by another name.
They did, and the linguistic evidence we have is staggering because it's just so widespread.
It's everywhere in the sources.
Yeah, the historical Allens were recorded across multiple, entirely different cultures and languages under a very specific cluster of root names.
So depending on whether you were, say, a Chinese scribe or a Roman historian.
Or a Russian chronicler, exactly. They were recorded as the Ez, Asi, Asi Jasi, Asi Osi, Asud, Yas, and Osud.
It's the as root. It always comes back to as.
It does.
And what blows my mind is how incredibly resilient that root name is. I mean, it survived for centuries across mind-boggling distances.
Give an example from notes.
Well, we have the Asud clan in Mongolia. The sources detail a joint Soviet-Mongolian ethnographic expedition that took place in 1984.
1984? That is incredibly recent.
Right, and these researchers found a group of people called the Asuds living among the Mongolian tribe of Borjigins.
And what's their lineage?
Tracing it back, these Asuds are the descendants of Hunnic people who were resettled in Mongolia during the Middle Ages to serve the Yuan dynasty.
The persistence of that identity is just remarkable. And it's not just in Mongolia.
Right.
You have the Jasog region in modern-day Hungary. That area was settled by the Jasik people, who were Alanic refugees that fled the Mongol invasions centuries later.
Wow.
And perhaps most famously, you have the Ossetians living in the Caucasus Mountains today.
Oh, right, the Ossetians.
Yeah, they speak an Iranian language and are the direct linguistic, cultural, and genetic descendants of the Alans.
So the root as or os simply refuses to die. It pops up in Chinese imperial records, Russian monastic chronicles, Hungarian geography, and the modern Caucasus.
It's incredibly consistent.
Okay, but I have to step in here on behalf of anyone listening who is natural and rightfully skeptical about this.
Please do. We need to pressure test this.
Because my initial thought when reading this was, okay, as sounds like Æsir, sure, but isn't it incredibly dangerous to just play word association with history?
It can be very dangerous, yes.
Because we have thousands of languages on Earth. People have similar sounding syllables all over the world. You could probably find a word that sounds like, as in an ancient South American language, if you looked hard enough.
You absolutely could.
Right. So how do we know this isn't just pareidolia, you know, when you look at a cloud and see a face, but with words? How is this not just a massive, meaningless linguistic coincidence?
It is the most important question to ask. And honestly, if all we had was a word that sounded like Æsir, this would be an incredibly short, highly unconvincing deep dive.
We'd just be grasping at straws.
Exactly. A name floating in a vacuum is academically worthless. But we aren't looking at a name in a vacuum.
What are we looking at?
We are looking at a specific name firmly tied to a specific geographic corridor operating during a specific timeline of mass migration.
And featuring a highly specific type of political and military structure.
Yes. When you stack the linguistic evidence on top of the geography, the chronology, and the sociology...
It's no longer just a word game.
Right. The convergence of all those data points moves this from a fun linguistic coincidence to a highly distinct historical fingerprint.
Okay, so if the name as is the fingerprint, the geography has to be the crime scene.
That's a good way to look at it.
We need to look at where the medieval texts actually place the gods and see if it lines up with the real world. Let's look at the famous 13th century Icelandic writer, Snorri Sturluson.
Snorri is crucial here. He is the guy who essentially wrote down the Norse mythology we know today.
So let's look at where Snorri placed his gods and compare it to where the Romans placed the real flesh and blood Allans.
Snorri wrote a text called the Ynglinga Saga. It serves as a prologue to his history of the Norse kings.
And in the very beginning of this saga, he basically acts as a geographer, right?
He does. He lays out a map of the inhabited world. He writes that the world is divided into 3 parts.
Europe, Asia, and Africa.
Exactly. And the boundary between Europe and Asia is defined by the Black Sea and a massive river that flows into it. Snorri explicitly names this river the Tanais.
And he doesn't just name the river. He says that east of this Tanais River is a physical land called Asaland, or Osaheim.
Literally the home of the As.
Yes. And the capital of this land is a fortress city called Asgard, which is ruled by a powerful chief named Odin.
That is Snorri's mythological map. He is giving us turn-by-turn directions.
So now we take that mythological map and we lay the hard empirical geographical extraction from our historical sources right over the top of it.
Let's do it. Where were the historical Alans, the people known as the As, actually living in the centuries before the Viking Age?
They operated in exactly the corridor Snorri describes,
They were located in the steppes between the lower Volga River, the Sea of Azov.
which the ancients called Meotis, right?
Yes, Meotis, the Cimmerian Bosporus, the Caucasus Mountains, and a major river called the Don.
And if we look up the ancient classical name for the Don River,
It is the Tanais.
I mean, that is the moment the hairs on the back of my neck stood up reading this.
It is a stunning convergence.
Snorri wasn't pointing to a magical floating Narnia. He didn't say Odin lived in the clouds or in some mystical realm at the center of the earth.
No, he essentially gave his readers a physical GPS coordinate for the Don River Basin, right on the edge of the Black Sea.
And when we look at the real history, ancient writers like Ptolemy point to that exact spot.
Josephus, the first-century historian who recorded devastating Alan military raids back in 72 AD, points to that exact spot.
And we also have the Roman historian Ammianus Marcellinus.
Right, Ammianus was a soldier. He actually fought in these regions. And he specifically places the Alans right around the Tanais.
Didn't he have a specific name for the Alans living there?
He did. In fact, Ammianus notes that the Alans who lived in the lower Tanais River Basin were literally referred to as the Tanites.
Wow.
What should really strike you listening to this is the structural accuracy of Snorri's map. No, we have to be fair here. It is a simplified map.
Sure, he's writing in the 13th century.
Right, and he is using a continental map derived from Christian universal history. The idea of the Black Sea and the Tanis River acting as the great divider between Europe and Asia, that's a classical, learned medieval concept.
It's called a TO map, right?
Exactly, a TO map. Snorri is highly educated. He knows this classical geography, but what he does is brilliant.
He merges them.
Yes, he uses that medieval learned geographical frame to house an older, inherited, native northern memory of an eastern homeland.
So the geographic coordinates of his pagan gods match the historical reality of the Az people perfectly.
Perfectly.
It's like he had an ancient family heirloom, this memory of coming from the Az homeland, and he put it inside a very modern 13th century display case so his contemporaries could understand it.
That's a beautiful way to frame it.
But that brings up a massive logistical problem. We have a people, the Az, we have their location, the Tanais River Basin.
But they don't stay there.
Right. The Æsir in Snorri's myths didn't stay in Asia. The whole point of the story is that they end up in northern Europe.
And neither did the historical Alans. They didn't just stay by the Black Sea forever.
So what forced them to move? If you are a terrifyingly powerful cavalry confederation, you don't just pack up and leave your prime grazing lands for no reason.
You definitely don't. It requires a massive catalyst for migration.
What's the catalyst in Snorri's account?
In Snorri's mythological account, the trigger is immense, unavoidable geopolitical upheaval. He writes that Odin possesses foresight.
So he sees something coming.
Right. Odin sees that powerful forces are subduing the world and that independent chiefs are being driven from their domains.
And Snorri specifically attributes this world-swallowing expansion to the Romans, doesn't he?
He does. Because of this massive geopolitical pressure from Rome, Snorri says Odin makes the decision to lead a massive following of his people westward.
Abandoning Asaland to find new territory.
Yes?
Okay, wait. This is where I started to get tripped up in the sources.
How so?
Because Snorri blames the Romans for driving the Æsir out of Asia. But if we look at the historical reality of the steppes in the late 4th century...
Around 350 to 450 AD, when the Great Migrations really kicked off.
Yeah, exactly then. The Romans weren't the ones pushing east into the Alan territories. The Romans were actually fighting for their lives.
The Western Empire was collapsing.
Right. The real force that pushed the Alans out was the Huns.
And the Hunnic arrival was nothing short of apocalyptic for the people living there.
I mean, the sources describe it as just a nightmare.
It was a catastrophic population shock. It absolutely shattered the Alan frontier. We are talking about a totally new, highly aggressive nomadic force sweeping in from further east.
And what happened to the Alans when the Huns hit?
Well, some Alan groups were subjugated and forced to join the Huns, but many other Alan groups were forced to flee westward.
Which created a massive, chaotic refugee crisis.
Yes, a desperate military migration into Europe.
So if the real historical trigger was this terrifying Hunnic invasion, why does Snorri blame Roman expansion? Is Snorri just a bad historian?
Well, some critics might say that.
Did he just get the facts wrong? Or is there a specific reason he swapped the villains in his story?
He didn't swap the villains out of ignorance. He swapped them because of the literary tools he had available to him.
Okay, explain that.
If we zoom out and look at how medieval historians worked, it makes perfect sense. This is a classic textbook case of historical compression.
The ZIP file again.
Exactly. You have to remember where Snorri is writing. He is in 12th and 13th century Iceland.
So he's pretty far removed from the actual events.
Very. And in that intellectual environment, classical Roman historical material was highly accessible and deeply respected.
They had Roman texts in Iceland.
Yes.
Yeah.
The Icelanders had translations of the Roman historian Sallust. They had translations of Lucan's epic bloody poem about the Roman Civil War, the Pharsalia.
Wow, really?
Yeah, these classic texts were actually combined and translated into an Icelandic text called the Rumvera Saga.
Wait, so they were literally reading the history of the Roman Empire in Old Norse in medieval Iceland?
They were. Roman history was the gold standard for describing how empires operated. Snorri didn't have a textbook on the geopolitical dynamics of the Hunnic invasions of the 4th century.
But he did have the memory.
Right, he had a deeply ingrained cultural memory of a time when great, unstoppable powers were swallowing kingdoms, causing the rulers of his ancestors to flee westward.
So he used the familiar, dramatic, deeply respected language of Roman imperial conquest to describe a massive, traumatic political collapse.
That's exactly it. Several centuries of Roman border wars, Hunnic conquests, and the total bloody collapse of the steppe frontier were reduced to one simple narrative cause.
A cause that his readers would instantly understand. The expanding empire drove us out.
Yes, it's the ZIP file operating in real time.
He compressed hundreds of years of complex frontier trauma, the Huns, the Goths, the shifting borders, into a single, elegant story arc. He used the Romans as a stand-in for unstoppable, world-ending empire.
And it worked brilliantly for his audience.
It did. But once this mass migration is triggered, the story gets even more complicated because the Alans don't just march in a straight, solitary line from the Black Sea to Scandinavia.
No, they don't have a map. They are moving through heavily populated territories.
Right, they collide head-on with the Germanic world, and that collision changes both cultures forever.
And remarkably, Snorri's mythic journey tracks this phase of the migration surprisingly well.
What does he say Odin does?
He writes that Odin and his massive following travel into Eastern Europe and eventually arrive in a place he calls Saxland.
And just to clarify for everyone listening, Saxland in this context refers broadly to the lands of the Saxons.
Right. The wider Germanic world of Central and Northern Europe.
So Odin gets to Saxland, then what?
There, Odin conquers territory, sets his various sons up as local rulers over the land, and only after establishing these dynasties does he eventually move further north into Sweden.
Setting his sons up as local rulers, that is super specific.
It is. And historically, during the migration period, the westward moving Alans did not travel alone in a vacuum. As we discussed, they were a confederation, used to absorbing and allying with others.
So they didn't just fight the Germanic tribes, they teamed up with them.
Exactly. As they fled the Huns and moved into Europe, they formed deep, highly integrated, mixed military coalitions with Germanic populations.
Like who?
We see them explicitly allied in the historical record with Germanic tribes like the Vandals, the Suebi, and the Goths.
They fought together, migrated together, and eventually settled together.
Yes. And the sources provide some incredible, specific human examples of how deep this cultural assimilation went.
It wasn't just two armies marching next to each other, right? They were blending families.
Deeply. Take the Roman general Aspar in the 5th century.
Okay, Aspar.
He was the master of soldiers in the Eastern Roman Empire, an incredibly powerful guy. He had Alan heritage.
But look at what he named his sons. This blew me away in the dossiers.
It's a perfect microcosm.
Right. His eldest son gets a traditional Alan name, Ardaburius.
Keeping the heritage alive.
Then his middle son gets a prestigious Roman name, Patricius.
Playing the political game in the empire.
And his youngest son gets a purely German name, Hermaneric. I mean, that is assimilation at its finest.
It really is. You also have historical figures like Gore.
Who was Gore?
Gore was an Alan priest and warlord operating in Armorica, which is modern-day Brittany in France, and he was dealing directly with local Roman and Germanic politics.
So they're fully embedded in the political landscape.
Yes. The example of Aspar's sons is brilliant because it perfectly illustrates the sociology of what is happening. This raises a vital question about how we, in the modern day, visualize ancient migration.
Because we always get it wrong.
We do. When we hear the word migration, we tend to think of a modern nation-state relocating its borders, displacing everyone else. But that is entirely wrong.
We have to look at the warband model.
Exactly. The Alans were highly mobile, heavily armed, professional cavalry elites. They moved as elite warbands, not as millions of farmers.
So when they met the Germanic tribes, what happened?
When these Alan warbands encountered and allied with Germanic tribes, they didn't wipe out the Germanic peasants and replace them. They became politically embedded within the existing Germanic structures.
They offered military protection and leadership in exchange for status and resources.
Precisely.
So I was trying to wrap my head around how that actually feels for the people on the ground. And the best analogy I could come up with is a massive corporate merger.
Well, let's hear it.
Specifically, like a hostile takeover that slowly turns into a joint venture. It's not like one company fires all the employees of the other company.
Right, you still need people to do the work.
Exactly. It's more like the highly aggressive elite executives of one company, in this case the Alan cavalry warlords, take over the boardroom of another company, the Germanic tribes.
I like this.
The people working on the factory floor are still Germanic. But the boardroom is now run by Alans.
And over a few generations of intermarriage.
Everyone in the company is wearing the same uniform. They're speaking the same Germanic language. But the culture of the boardroom, the leadership, the ideology, the way they do business has fundamentally, permanently shifted.
That is a highly accurate way to visualize it. The Hellenic elites successfully embedded themselves into the upper echelons of Germanic culture.
They intermarried with local Germanic royalty. They ruled over Germanic populations.
And this brings us to the most profound, almost magical transformation of this entire historical process.
Which is how they became gods.
Exactly. How did the memory of these embedded Alan warlords transform? How do human generals who lived, fought, and died turn into the supreme gods of the Viking Age?
How do Woden's men literally become Woden the god?
To figure that out, we have to look closely at Odin's specific traits in the Norse myths.
Because Odin's isn't a generic god, right? He's not a god of thunderstorms or a god of the harvest who makes the wheat grow.
No, he is a highly specialized deity.
He is fundamentally a war chief. He presides over blood sacrifices. He is surrounded by exactly 12 leading priests or chieftains.
He has magical wolves and ravens that act as his scouts.
And most importantly, Snorri notes that Odin is famous because victory simply follows him in every battle. His men believe that as long as they follow him, they cannot lose.
He is the Herefather, the ultimate archetypal lord of the warband.
Okay, so that is the mythological profile of Odin.
Now, hold that profile in your mind and compare it to the documented historical steppe culture of the Alans.
Ammianus Marcellinus comes back into play here, right?
He does. The Roman historian Ammianus wrote a detailed ethnographic account of the Alans. He noted that they did not have temples in the traditional Roman sense.
So what did they worship?
Instead, they worshipped a naked iron sword fixed into the bare earth as their god of war.
Wow, just a sword in the dirt.
Yeah. Ammianus writes that they believed those who died in battle were blessed and chosen, while dying of old age was seen as a disgrace.
Which sounds incredibly familiar.
Their entire religious and social focus was overwhelmingly concentrated on the elite horse warrior, martial success, and absolute loyalty to the warband leader.
The parallels are just chilling. The culture of the steppe is identical to the culture of Valhalla.
It really is.
And it's not just textual comparisons, is it? There is hard interdisciplinary archaeological research backing up how this culture clash physically played out on the ground in Northern Europe.
Yes. The Danish archaeologist Lotte Hedegaard has done incredible groundbreaking work on this exact period.
What does her theory argue?
Her theory argues that the massive Hunnic and steppe presence in Central Europe in the 5th century radically, permanently changed Scandinavian symbolic, religious, and political strategies.
Okay, how so?
Well, what her research shows is that the elite horse warrior culture of the steppes, the gold artifacts, the animal-style art, the ideology of the mounted warlord, merged with native Scandinavian traditions.
So the locals started copying them.
Basically, yeah. The ideology of the ruling class in Scandinavia shifted dramatically during this period to mirror the power structures they were encountering, trading with, and fighting alongside down in Central Europe.
Because that was the apex of military power at the time.
Exactly. The native Germanic elites essentially adopted the swagger, the art, and the mythology of the steppe nomads.
But I want to stop you right there because I am looking at this from the outside, and I just know someone listening is shouting this at their speakers right now.
Go ahead.
Does Odin have to be an imported Allen?
Right.
Couldn't the Germanic people living in Scandinavia have just had their own native war god already? Why do we need to invent this complex theory where they import a god from the Black Sea? Didn't they already know how to fight?
That is exactly the pushback mainstream historians offer, and it is a vital point to clarify.
So what is the answer?
The answer is yes. The Germanic peoples absolutely had existing native gods of war. They had indigenous deities long before the Alans arrived.
Okay, so then why?
We are not arguing that a historical Alan king rode into Sweden, planted a flag in the snow, and invented a god named Odin out of thin air while the locals watched in confusion.
Right, that is not how myth-making works.
So what is the actual mechanism?
Yeah, how does a native Germanic god and a foreign Allan warlord become the exact same thing?
Syncretism.
Syncretism. Okay, explain that.
Imagine that immigrant elite we talked about, the Allan boardroom executives. They carry the prestigious as identity.
Right.
They settle in Germanic lands, adopt the local Germanic language over a few generations, and marry into the ruling families.
They are fully blending in.
Over centuries of oral storytelling, three distinct things begin to fuse together in the cultural memory. First, you have the immigrant founder memory.
The legendary semi-historical ancestor who led their people out of the terrifying East during the Hunnic Wars.
Second, you have their prestigious title or tribal name, the Æsir.
And
third, you have an existing native Germanic deity associated with war, frenzy, and death. Because the new ruling class claims descent from the great founder and the native people worship the war god over hundreds of years, the oral tradition simply merges them.
Time compresses the mortal warlord and the immortal god into one indistinguishable mythic figure. The traumatic history of the migration becomes the foundational mythology of the Æsir.
Exactly. History becomes mythology.
It is the historical telephone game played over half a millennium across thousands of miles. The mortal edges are sanded off, and only the magic remains.
Beautifully said.
But we have to address the elephant in the room.
Snorri.
Yes, Snorri Sturluson himself. Because the biggest hurdle to this entire theory, the primary reason a lot of mainstream historians still roll their eyes at it, is the author.
The author of the text always comes under scrutiny.
Skeptics argue that Snorri was just a 13th century Christian politician who wanted to make up cool, respectable backstories for his pagan ancestors.
They do say that.
They say, look, Snorri was just reading Latin textbooks. He saw the story of the fall of Troy and the Roman Empire, and he just pasted the words Troy and Asia onto Norse myths to make his barbarian ancestors look sophisticated to his European peers.
Right, it's a very common critique.
So, to figure out if he's lying, we have to actually look at his writing process. Who was this guy, and what was he actually reading?
To understand Snorri, you have to understand where he was educated. Snorri was raised at a place called Odin, which was an elite Icelandic school and intellectual center.
He wasn't just some guy in a hut.
Far from it. His foster father, John Lofsson, was arguably the most powerful, educated man in Iceland at the time.
So Snorri had access to the best education possible.
Yes. At Odin, Snorri didn't just learn how to swing a sword or farm sheep. He received a deeply rigorous, incredibly broad education that bridged two completely different worlds.
Which two worlds?
Well, he learned native Icelandic genealogies, the impossibly complex rules of native skaldic verse, and native law.
So he knew the old ways.
But he also learned classical Christian history, geography, and Latin literature.
He was a highly educated guy operating at the exact intersection of pagan memory and Christian scholarship.
He was. And modern scholars haven't just guessed at what he knew. They have actively tracked down the exact source books he was reading in that school.
That is amazing. So let's break down the components of Snorri's writing, starting with what critics call the Trojan frame.
Okay, the Trojan frame.
Snorri connects the Æsir to Troy, and he says they came from Asia. Critics immediately point to this and say, see, he made it up. He wanted Odin to be like a Trojan prince to sound like the Romans.
Like I said, it is a common critique. But the scholars who study Snorri's texts the most closely, like Anthony Falks, know exactly which books Snorri was using at Odin.
And did he pull Troy out of thin air?
No, he didn't. He used a specific text called the Troeumana saga, which was an Icelandic translation based on a much older Latin text written by an author known as Dares the Phrygian.
Okay, dares the Phrygian.
And if you go back and read that original source text, it already contained names like Aeseus, Ascanius, and Odius.
Wow. Okay, that changes everything.
Doesn't it?
Yeah. So Snorri didn't sit down at his desk and maliciously invent a fake, clever connection between Troy, Asia, and names that sound suspiciously like Æsir and Odin.
The linguistic similarities were already right there in his source material.
I mean, that is precisely the point. He didn't invent the Troy and Asia connection as a political lie. It was part of the standard Latin learning he was taught.
Exactly. He saw the similarities and drew a logical medieval conclusion. But crucially, Snorri didn't invent the migration story either.
Right, this wasn't just him copying a Latin book and changing the names.
No. He inherited the core, beating heart of the migration memory from an older, entirely native source, which we can call the Northern Pipeline.
Unpack that Northern Pipeline for us.
Okay.
Where is he getting the pagan side of the story?
Snorri drew on earlier native works, like the now-lost Skjöldunga saga. He relied on oral reports, ancient family genealogies, and, most importantly, incredibly old skaldic poems.
Skaldic poetry. That stuff is famously complicated.
Very. We have to understand what skaldic poetry actually was. It wasn't just free verse poetry where you could make things up because it sounded pretty.
It had rules.
Insanely strict rules. It had an incredibly rigid meter and rhyme scheme. It functioned as a highly reliable mnemonic device.
A way to lock historical data into human memory.
Exactly. A court poet couldn't just invent a fake history for a king because the entire court knew the rules of the poem and the history of the family. If you messed it up, everyone knew.
So it's essentially a historical database stored in rhyme.
Yes. These poems, like the Ynglingatal, carried the native, uncorrupted northern memory of a people moving from the east, fleeing a great terror and settling in the north.
So if we connect all of this to the bigger picture, Snorri's true genius, or perhaps his profound confusion, was that he had two massive streams of knowledge pouring into his head at the exact same time.
Precisely.
He had the inherited ironclad northern memory from the skaldic poems.
The As Migration, the Flight from the East, the warlord Odin.
And he had the Latin Christian learning from his school books.
The Teo maps of Asia, the fall of Troy, the expanding Roman Empire.
And what he did was synthesize them.
He did. He used the respected Latin stream to explain, contextualize, and legitimize the native northern memory.
He built a respectable, classical Trojan structure around a real historical core that he had inherited from his own culture's oral tradition.
The framework he uses is medieval scholarship, but the core memory trapped inside that framework is the historical reality of the Atlantic migration.
Man, this is a lot to take in.
We have covered a massive amount of historical and geographic ground.
We really have. So let's pull all the threads together and synthesize this whole investigation. Let's summarize the case we built today.
Okay.
Snorri Sturluson, writing in 13th century Iceland, places a ruling group of people called the Æsir in a physical location called Assaland.
Right.
He puts that land right near a river.
Yeah.
He explicitly calls it Tanais. He says this group is displaced by massive imperial expansion, causing them to move west into Germanic lands, where they embed themselves politically and form new, legendary royal dynasties.
That's the myth. And if we look at the unyielding historical record,
Let's hear it.
a highly formidable professional warrior people known as the As or the Alans lived exactly near the Tanais.
Which we know today as the Don River.
Exactly. They were violently displaced by a massive imperial shock, the arrival of the Huns.
Right.
They moved west in documented, heavily integrated military coalitions with Germanic peoples, and they became deeply embedded in European elite dynasties, leaving their cultural mark from Spain all the way up to Scandinavia.
I mean, the parallels are not just interesting, they are staggering. They line up perfectly.
They really do. And this raises what is perhaps the most important question for you listening right now.
What's that?
I want you to genuinely ponder the math of coincidence here, to completely reject this theory, to say it is all just a fantasy.
You have to believe a lot of accidents happen.
You have to believe that the names, the specific geography of the Black Sea, the highly specific political structure of the warband, the westward migration pattern, the chronology of the imperial shock, and the timeline, the cultural fusion, all lined up by pure, absolute, sheer accident.
You would literally have to believe that Snorri Sturluson threw a dart at Map of the World and accidentally hit the exact river basin where a people called the Æsir actually lived.
Right.
And that those people were accidentally driven west at the exact right time and accidentally merged with the exact same Germanic tribes that Snorri's ancestors belonged to.
The mathematical probability of that being a coincidence is practically zero.
At what point does calling all of that an accident become less convincing and fundamentally less scientific than simply admitting the obvious?
Which is that Snorri Sturluson preserved a badly compressed, deeply mythologized, but fundamentally real historical truth.
It leaves you with a deeply haunting thought, doesn't it?
It does.
If the mighty Æsir Odin, Thor, Tyr are actually the mythological ghosts of the historical Allens, how many other myths, legends, or fairy tales are you taking for granted right now?
It makes you wonder.
What other gods are sitting in our pop culture, starring in our movies, that are really just the ghosts of real flesh and blood people whose stories somehow managed to survive the violent, fiery collapse of their civilizations?
It forces us to realize that human history is rarely lost completely. It just changes its shape to survive.
To follow the investigation, visit woodensman.com.